Detective Jessica Kane discovered the horrifying truth about victim selection when she realized she matched the exact profile of 7 women who had vanished without a trace. The killer wasn't choosing randomly. He was following a specific psychological blueprint that made certain women irresistible targets for his twisted games. Jessica had been investigating the disappearances for 6 months, convinced she was hunting a serial killer who operated with unusual precision and planning. Each victim seemed to have nothing in common beyond basic demographics. But Jessica's breakthrough came when she started analyzing their psychological profiles rather than their physical characteristics. The pattern that emerged made her blood run cold. Every missing woman had recently experienced a significant life transition that left them emotionally vulnerable and socially isolated. They had moved to new cities, started new jobs, ended long-term relationships, or lost family members. The killer was specifically targeting women who were rebuilding their lives, women who had fewer social connections to notice their absence quickly. Jessica's own life matched this pattern perfectly. She had transferred to the precinct 3 months ago, following a messy divorce, knew almost no one in the city, and had been working cases alone while struggling to establish new professional relationships. The realization that she was exactly the type of victim this predator preferred sent waves of paranoia through every aspect of her daily routine. The psychological profile revealed a killer who understood vulnerability in ways that suggested professional training or personal experience with manipulation tactics. He wasn't just opportunistic. He was studying potential targets, learning their routines, identifying their emotional weak points, and timing his approach for maximum psychological impact. This level of sophistication indicated someone who had been perfecting his methods for years. Jessica's investigation into the missing women's final weeks showed a disturbing pattern of contact with the same individual across multiple victims. A man who appeared in security footage near their workplaces, who had brief conversations with them in coffee shops, who seemed to accidentally encounter them in places where they felt safe and unguarded. He was conducting reconnaissance on each target before making his move. The breakthrough came when Jessica realized the killer was using social media and dating apps to gather detailed psychological information about potential victims. He created fake profiles that appealed to lonely transitioning women, engaged them in conversations designed to reveal their insecurities and fears, then used that information to approach them in person with carefully crafted scenarios that made them feel understood and valued. Jessica's own dating app activity from the past few months revealed multiple conversations with profiles that now seemed suspiciously similar in their approach. Someone had been studying her psychological responses, learning what made her feel comfortable and trusting, gathering information that could be used to manipulate her into a vulnerable situation. The predator had been hunting her for weeks without her realizing it. The most terrifying aspect of the killer's victim selection process was his patience and methodical approach. He didn't grab women impulsively. He invested months in psychological preparation, creating elaborate scenarios that made his targets feel like they were making their own choices. By the time they realized they were in danger, They were already completely under his control. Jessica found evidence that the killer had been documenting his victim selection process in detail, keeping psychological profiles and behavioral notes that read like case studies in manipulation and control. He viewed his targets not as human beings but as subjects in an ongoing experiment designed to perfect his ability to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities in isolated women. The investigation revealed that the killer's victim selection criteria went beyond simple vulnerability. He specifically chose women who were intelligent, independent, and strong-willed, because breaking down their psychological defenses provided him with a greater sense of power and accomplishment. He wasn't interested in easy targets. He wanted women who would challenge his manipulative abilities. Jessica's analysis of the crime scenes and victim profiles suggested that the killer's ultimate goal wasn't just murder, but psychological domination. He wanted to prove that he could identify any woman's breaking point and manipulate her into complete submission, regardless of her strength, intelligence, or previous life experiences. The killing was secondary to the psychological conquest. As Jessica delved deeper into the case, she realized that her own investigation was being monitored. Someone was tracking her progress, anticipating her discoveries, and staying one step ahead of her efforts to identify him. The hunter had become the hunted, and Jessica was walking directly into a trap that had been months in the making. The killer's victim selection process was so sophisticated that Jessica began to question whether her assignment to this case had been coincidental. Had she been chosen to investigate these disappearances because she fit the victim profile so perfectly? Was her entire professional involvement part of an elaborate psychological game designed to provide the killer with his most challenging target yet? Standing in her empty apartment, surrounded by case files that painted a picture of her own vulnerability, Jessica realized she was facing a predator who understood the psychology of victim selection better than anyone she'd ever encountered. The rules of the game were about to change, and Jessica suspected she was about to discover just how accurately the killer had assessed her own psychological weaknesses. Maria Santos thought she was finally getting her life back together when the charming stranger in the bookstore seemed to understand her pain better than anyone she'd ever met. 3 months after her husband's death in a car accident, Maria was struggling with grief, loneliness, and the overwhelming task of rebuilding her identity as a single woman rather than half of a married couple. The man who introduced himself as David appeared at exactly the right moment in Maria's healing process, when she was emotionally ready to consider trusting someone new but still vulnerable enough to overlook warning signs that might have been obvious under different circumstances. His timing wasn't coincidental. It was the result of weeks of careful observation and psychological assessment. David seemed to know exactly what to say to make Maria feel seen and understood. He shared stories about his own experience with loss, offered insights into the grieving process that resonated perfectly with Maria's emotional state, and demonstrated a level of empathy that felt almost too good to be true. Maria's rational mind recognized that his understanding seemed suspiciously perfect, but her lonely heart desperately wanted to believe in the connection. Maria's sister Carmen had warned her about moving too fast with new relationships, but Maria found herself drawn to David's apparent emotional maturity and his ability to discuss difficult topics without making her feel pressured or judged. He never pushed for physical intimacy, never demanded more time than she was willing to give, and seemed content to let their relationship develop at whatever pace felt comfortable for Maria. The psychological manipulation was so subtle that Maria didn't recognize it as manipulation at all. David was using techniques designed to create artificial intimacy and emotional dependence while maintaining the illusion that Maria was in complete control of the relationship's progression. Every conversation was carefully crafted to deepen her trust while revealing more information about her psychological vulnerabilities. David's questions about Maria's daily routine, her work schedule, her family relationships, and her living situation felt like natural expressions of romantic interest rather than intelligence gathering for potential criminal activity. He was learning everything he needed to know about her life while making her feel valued and cared for in ways she hadn't experienced since her husband's death. Maria began sharing details about her grief counseling sessions, her struggles with anxiety, her fears about starting over in middle age, and her guilt about moving forward with her life while her husband was dead. David listened with apparent compassion and understanding, but he was actually cataloging her emotional triggers and psychological weak points for future use in his manipulation strategy. The red flags that Maria dismissed as quirks or minor inconsistencies were actually signs that David's entire persona was carefully constructed rather than genuine. His stories about his past contained subtle contradictions, his emotional responses seemed slightly rehearsed, and his knowledge about her interests and preferences was more comprehensive than their brief acquaintance should have allowed. Maria's growing dependence on David's emotional support was exactly what he had been working to achieve. He had positioned himself as her primary source of comfort and validation during a vulnerable period in her life, creating a psychological dynamic where losing his approval would feel devastating. This artificial emotional dependency made Maria more willing to overlook concerning behaviors and less likely to seek outside perspectives on their relationship. The manipulation escalated when David began introducing small elements of control into their interactions. He suggested changes to Maria's routine that would make her more isolated from friends and family, offered to help with decisions that she was perfectly capable of making herself, and gradually positioned himself as the most important person in her emotional support system. Maria's grief counselor had warned her about predatory individuals who targeted recently widowed women. But David seemed so different from the obvious opportunists she'd been told to avoid. He wasn't interested in her money, didn't pressure her for physical intimacy, and appeared to genuinely care about her emotional well-being. This sophisticated approach made him much more dangerous than the obvious predators she'd been taught to recognize. The psychological trap was closing around Maria without her awareness. David had successfully created a relationship dynamic where Maria felt increasingly dependent on his approval and support while gradually becoming more isolated from other sources of emotional stability. He was preparing her for the next phase of his plan, which would involve much more direct forms of control and manipulation. Maria's friends and family began expressing concern about how quickly she was becoming serious about David, but their warnings only pushed her closer to him. David had anticipated this reaction and had prepared Maria to view outside criticism of their relationship as evidence that other people were jealous of her happiness or didn't understand the special connection they shared. The psychological conditioning was working exactly as David had planned. Maria was becoming emotionally dependent on someone who viewed her not as a romantic partner, but as a carefully selected victim whose psychological profile made her ideal for his ultimate purposes. Her vulnerability, her isolation, her grief, and her desperate need for connection had made her the perfect target for a predator who specialized in exploiting the psychology of loss and recovery. As Maria prepared to introduce David to her family and consider taking their relationship to the next level, she had no idea that every aspect of their connection had been engineered to manipulate her into a position of complete psychological vulnerability. The caring, understanding man she was falling in love with was actually a predator who had chosen her specifically because her emotional state made her easy to control and unlikely to be missed quickly if she disappeared. Dr. Angela Martinez had spent 15 years studying criminal psychology, but she never expected to become a case study herself until she realized the consulting opportunity that seemed too good to be true was actually an elaborate trap designed specifically for her expertise and personality type. The killer wasn't just choosing random victims. He was selecting individuals whose professional knowledge would make them more challenging and satisfying targets. Angela had been approached by someone claiming to represent a private research foundation interested in her work on predator behavior and victim selection patterns. The lucrative consulting contract offered her the chance to analyze real case files and contribute to what was described as groundbreaking research into criminal psychology. Angela's academic pride and financial pressures made the opportunity irresistible. The consultation work required Angela to travel to a remote research facility where she would have access to confidential case files and interview materials that weren't available through traditional academic channels. The isolation was presented as necessary for maintaining the confidentiality of ongoing investigations, but Angela began to suspect it was actually designed to cut her off from outside support and verification. Angela's expertise in victim psychology allowed her to recognize manipulation tactics that other targets might miss. But the killer had anticipated this advantage and had developed more sophisticated approaches specifically designed to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of intelligent, analytical women. He was using Angela's professional confidence against her, challenging her expertise in ways that made her determined to prove her capabilities. The case files Angela was asked to analyze contained detailed information about women who had been stalked, manipulated, and ultimately murdered by someone with extensive knowledge of psychological manipulation techniques. As Angela studied the materials, she began to recognize patterns that seemed designed to teach her about her own vulnerability, rather than contribute to legitimate research. The killer's victim selection process was revealed through the case files to be incredibly sophisticated, involving months of psychological profiling environmental manipulation, and gradual isolation techniques that prepared targets for abduction without triggering their survival instincts. Angela realized with growing horror that the consultation work was actually providing her with a blueprint of exactly how she was being manipulated. Angela's attempts to verify the legitimacy of the research foundation revealed that the organization existed only on paper, with fake credentials, fabricated testimonials, and financial backing that couldn't be traced to any legitimate source. She was working for someone who had created an entire fictional research institution specifically to gain access to her expertise and exploit her professional vulnerabilities. The psychological trap was more elaborate than anything Angela had encountered in her academic work. The killer had studied her published research, her teaching methods, her professional relationships, and her personal history to create a scenario that would appeal perfectly to her intellectual curiosity and professional ambitions. He had essentially weaponized her own expertise against her. Angela discovered that several of the previous victims had also been approached with professional opportunities that seemed perfectly tailored to their individual career goals and personal interests. The killer was conducting extensive research into each target's professional life, using their career ambitions and intellectual pride to lure them into isolated situations where he could implement more direct control measures. The realization that she was trapped came when Angela attempted to leave the research facility and found that her transportation had been sabotaged and her communication devices had been disabled. The remote location that had seemed like a professional advantage was actually a carefully chosen prison where the killer could implement the final phases of his victim control strategy without interference. Angela's psychological training helped her understand the killer's methodology, but that knowledge also made her situation more terrifying because she could recognize how thoroughly she had been manipulated and how systematically he had closed off her escape options. Her professional expertise, which she had always viewed as a strength, had been turned into a vulnerability that made her a more appealing target. The killer revealed himself as someone who had been studying Angela's work for years, using her own published research on victim psychology to design more effective manipulation techniques. He viewed her not just as a target, but as an unwilling collaborator whose expertise would help him perfect his methods for selecting and controlling future victims. Angela realized that the killer's ultimate goal was to prove that even experts in manipulation and control could be successfully victimized if the psychological trap was sophisticated enough. He wanted to demonstrate that intelligence, education, and professional knowledge were insufficient protection against someone who truly understood how to exploit human psychological vulnerabilities. The case files Angela had been analyzing weren't just research materials. They were psychological conditioning tools designed to familiarize her with the killer's methods while simultaneously desensitizing her to the violence he was capable of inflicting. He had been preparing her psychologically for her own victimization, while making her believe she was contributing to important academic work. Angela's training in criminal psychology became both her greatest asset and her most significant liability as she prepared to face someone who had spent years studying her professional methods and personal weaknesses. The killer had chosen her specifically because breaking down someone with her expertise would provide the ultimate validation of his psychological manipulation abilities. The academic conference presentation Angela had been promised was actually going to be her own case study. A detailed analysis of how even psychological experts could be successfully manipulated and controlled when the predator understood their professional vulnerabilities and intellectual blind spots. Angela was about to become both the subject and the object of the most sophisticated psychological manipulation she had ever encountered. Detective Rebecca Walsh never suspected that her investigation into victim selection patterns would reveal that she herself had been chosen as the ultimate target in a twisted psychological experiment spanning multiple years and countless victims. The killer wasn't just selecting random women. He was conducting a long-term study of law enforcement's ability to recognize and respond to sophisticated psychological manipulation, using real detectives as unwitting test subjects. Rebecca's assignment to investigate the missing women cases hadn't been coincidental or based on her investigative skills. She had been specifically requested for the case by someone within the department who was working with the killer to provide access to law enforcement personnel who matched specific psychological profiles. The entire investigation had been designed as a trap to study how trained professionals responded to evidence of their own victimization. The breakthrough came when Rebecca discovered that every detective who had previously worked on similar cases in other jurisdictions had eventually become victims themselves, their disappearances attributed to job-related stress, personal problems, or voluntary departures from law enforcement. The killer was systematically targeting the investigators who got too close to understanding his victim selection methodology. Rebecca's psychological profile made her an ideal subject for the killer's research into law enforcement vulnerabilities. She was recently divorced, professionally isolated, emotionally guarded, and intellectually proud of her investigative abilities. These characteristics made her simultaneously vulnerable to manipulation and likely to pursue the investigation with the kind of obsessive dedication that would lead her directly into the killer's trap. The killer's ultimate experiment was designed to prove that even trained law enforcement professionals could be psychologically manipulated and controlled if the approach was sophisticated enough and sustained over sufficient time. Rebecca's entire career had been monitored and influenced by someone studying how to exploit the kivinki, psychological vulnerabilities that were common among female detectives working in male-dominated environments. Rebecca realized with growing horror that the evidence she had been finding throughout her investigation had been carefully planted to guide her toward specific conclusions and behaviors. The killer had been controlling the pace and direction of her investigation, feeding her information designed to increase her emotional investment in the case while simultaneously making her more psychologically vulnerable to his ultimate manipulation strategy. The victim selection process that Rebecca had been studying was actually a blueprint for her own victimization. Every woman who had disappeared had been chosen based on criteria that Rebecca herself matched perfectly, and their cases had been designed to teach her about her own vulnerability while making her believe she was hunting a predator rather than being hunted by one. The killer's psychological profiling of Rebecca had included surveillance of her personal life, analysis of her professional methods, assessment of her emotional triggers, and identification of the specific circumstances that would make her most likely to lower her guard and trust someone who appeared to be helping with the investigation. He had been preparing for years to implement his final manipulation strategy against her. Rebecca's discovery that her police department contact was actually working with the killer revealed the true scope of the psychological experiment. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states had been infiltrated by individuals who were identifying suitable test subjects among female investigators and creating scenarios designed to study their responses to sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. The killer's motivation went beyond simple predatory behavior. He was conducting unauthorized research into the psychological vulnerabilities of law enforcement professionals, using real victims to test theories about how trained investigators could be manipulated and controlled. Rebecca and the other missing women had been unwilling subjects in a study that violated every ethical principle of human research. Rebecca's confrontation with her own victimization forced her to on victimization with her own victimization with her own victimization, forced her to question everything she thought she knew about her professional judgment, her investigative skills, and her ability to recognize manipulation and deception. The killer had successfully demonstrated that even experienced law enforcement professionals could be psychologically controlled. The manipulation was subtle enough and implemented over sufficient time. The psychological manipulation had been so thorough that Rebecca began to doubt her own memories and perceptions, wondering how much of her investigation had been genuine discovery and how much had been carefully orchestrated revelation designed to prepare her for the killer's ultimate demonstration of control. Her professional confidence, which had always been her greatest strength, had been systematically undermined and weaponized against her. The killer's final revelation was that Rebecca's entire career in law enforcement had been influenced by his research team, with promotions, assignments, and professional opportunities carefully managed to create the psychological conditions that would make her an ideal test subject for his ultimate experiment in manipulating trained investigators. Rebecca realized that her only chance of survival lay in using her understanding of the killer's methodology against him, turning his own psychological manipulation techniques into weapons that could be used to escape his control. The investigation had taught her exactly how predators selected and manipulated their victims, and now she needed to use that knowledge to avoid becoming the final data point in his twisted research project. The psychological battle that followed would determine not only Rebecca's survival but also the fate of other law enforcement professionals who were being studied and manipulated by predators who had turned victim selection into a science. Rebecca's ability to resist psychological manipulation would prove whether training and awareness could overcome sophisticated long-term conditioning designed to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of those who dedicated their lives to protecting others. The killer's experiment had revealed terrifying truths about how easily even trained professionals could be psychologically manipulated when the approach was subtle, sustained, and specifically designed to exploit their individual vulnerabilities. But Rebecca's resistance would also demonstrate that understanding the psychology of victim selection could provide the knowledge necessary to break free from even the most sophisticated psychological traps. The truth about how predators choose their victims reveals that evil doesn't select randomly. It studies, plans, and manipulates with terrifying precision. If this psychological thriller opened your eyes to the sophisticated methods predators use to identify and control their targets, subscribe now for more stories that expose the dark psychology behind human evil. Share this with someone who needs to understand these manipulation tactics, and comment below with your thoughts on how we can better protect ourselves and others from psychological predators. Your engagement helps us continue revealing the hidden truths about human behavior that could save lives and prevent others from becoming victims of those who turn psychology into a weapon.